The battles in North Africa during World War II will forever be remembered as some of the greatest, most significant, and bloodiest fought under literally impossible conditions. The extreme measures to which these soldiers, both Allies and Axis, were forced are far beyond what we could imagine today from our air-conditioned homes, let alone endure. Today we will describe what the war in North Africa looked like, the kinds of battles fought there, describe the brutal conditions the soldiers encountered, and some of the interesting tactics used to overcome the merciless terrain and turn it against the enemy. From 1940 to 1943, bloody battles were fought in North Africa, primarily between British and later joined American forces against Axis German and Italian troops. The main goal of both sides was control over oil resources and the Suez Canal, both crucial for winning the war. This war would see great tank battles on wide and open spaces with a cat-and-mouse game between enemies in a race to outsmart, overpower, and occupy the most strategically significant positions. As this video will focus on the conditions in which the battles were fought, let's start from the mere fact that you are in the desert. Besides the fact that during the day the sun and temperatures over 120 degrees Fahrenheit or 50 degrees Celsius can kill you, and at night below freezing you are literally dead, if unprotected and exposed. The desert was dangerous enough for soldiers, even without the presence of the enemy. More important than weapons and manpower is precisely what the desert lacks: water. Gathering and preserving it required literal ingenuity. British water cans could not even withstand the rough desert conditions, so they had to copy the German version, which proved better, famously called the jerry can. Pipelines were constructed to provide water, as well as water trucks, which were prime targets for enemy forces. If you disable the enemy's water supply, you can win in just a few days without firing a single shot. There might not be water, but there is something in unlimited quantities that can drive you to madness: sand. Besides entering every crevice of the human body, eyes, mouth, lungs, water, food, etc., sand was a nightmare for all equipment from weapons, tanks, artillery, vehicles to watches and compasses. For example, vehicle engines in the desert had a lifespan 5 times shorter than in normal conditions. There are also sandstorms, which could appear suddenly and be extremely powerful, changing the entire landscape and covering roads and paths with sand. Convoys had to travel closely together in a group so as not to get lost, and navigation could only be done with a compass because visibility due to wind and sand was often zero, and tracks from the lead vehicle would quickly be buried in sand, so the convoy had to be tightly formed, ideal for a deadly artillery or air attack. Besides drastically reduced visibility due to sand, there is also the extreme temperature which would create a haze that blurs the horizon, creating optical illusions and making it impossible to distinguish whether a vehicle is moving towards you, standing still, or if it's just a destroyed tank only a kilometre away from you. The two main types of terrain in the desert are stony ground and ridges, and sand dunes which were impassable for vehicles and a nightmare to navigate through. Then, in North Africa, due to the unlimited wide front, a huge number of landmines were used for the first time on such a large scale. Because sandstorms could relocate minefields who knows where, they even today kill unfortunate people who come across them. This was the first time a mine detector was used, however. As they were not very reliable initially, a safer method was prodding the ground with bayonets. This job was often assigned to POWs, with the words, "You laid them, now you clear them." The infantry mostly lived in tents or even slept in the open, almost completely exposed to the elements, extreme heat during the day and extreme cold at night. The lack of water almost entirely prevented personal hygiene, and skin diseases, lice and other parasites were common. And when soldiers tried to refresh themselves or eat, a huge number of flies would appear, destroying even the slightest attempt at comfort and making life in the desert additionally unbearable. As if that weren't enough, There were poisonous scorpions and snakes to keep things interesting. Throughout the 3-year campaign, British soldiers had no home leave. The only comfort was a trip to Cairo or Alexandria, or a swim in the sea for those near the coast. For soldiers on both sides, every day was about surviving the hell of the desert, except on those days when the horror of battle momentarily pushed aside the heat and thirst with the immediate fear for their lives. In the desert, with no natural shelter, both sides worked daily on defensive fortifications, barbed wires, minefields, trenches, and dugouts in rocky and sandy ground. Soldiers filled thousands of sandbags daily under the scorching sun, constantly anticipating an attack. Anti-aircraft and anti-tank guns had to be prepared and ready for action constantly, never knowing what the enemy's next move might be. Besides water, the next essential fluid for survival and combat in the desert was fuel. Armoured and motorised divisions were heavily dependent on a steady supply of fuel, making supply lines a prime target. Patrols would be sent deep into enemy territory to disrupt supply lines, along with constant air attacks, making the delivery of food, ammunition and medical supplies extremely dangerous. The British had special long-range desert groups that carried out various missions deep behind enemy lines, and were specially trained and equipped to survive independently in the desert, sometimes for weeks at a time. Now imagine the heat in a car in the sun with the windows closed and no air conditioning, except that this car is made of metal and in the desert. Tanks were literally ovens, and tank crews even fried eggs on the exterior of their armour. Ventilation was terrible, and the tank engine and hydraulics only added to the temperature, creating a danger of heat stroke for its crew. In addition to standard claustrophobia and the constant discomfort of the tank, now there was also life-threatening temperature and sand that sometimes reduced visibility to nearly zero. Tank crews often wouldn't see the enemy until they were extremely close, and battles were chaotic and disorienting. Besides all this, crews had to contend with frequent breakdowns of their machines due to sand and high temperatures that pushed tanks and their crews beyond their limits. Aircraft were crucial in scouting enemy activities, and ground attack aircraft could inflict significant damage on enemy tank formations and artillery positions, which was particularly effective in the open desert where cover was minimal. Dive bombers and fighter bombers like the Stuka in the Axis forces and the P-40 Warhawk in the Allied forces were the most feared aircraft. Soldiers on both sides used camouflage to hide from enemy detection, painting equipment and tanks in sand colours to blend in with the terrain. Various misdirections and traps were also used by both sides. For example, tanks would be disguised as trucks or trucks as tanks to deceive the enemy and prevent a real assessment of enemy forces and their positions. Fake tanks, airplanes and airports were made from dummies, and raising dust and sand was used to create a false impression of troop movement. Rommel, for example, would attack in wide arcs and then drastically change direction to confuse the Allies and prevent them from predicting where he would strike exactly. And aircraft engines on trucks were used to raise sand, creating the impression that a much stronger force was attacking than actually was. All in all, life and battles in the desert pushed these soldiers beyond human limits, as they faced and overcame extreme physical and mental challenges every day.